I was born into a Jewish home, the only child of Dr. Morton and Juliet Dvores. Really, this is their story, so I'd like to start out by introducing them to you. My dad was a rather extraordinary individual. He was an amazing athlete. He stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, yet received offers to play professional basketball. For many years, he was state champion in New Jersey in a number of sports. He was also an incredibly social man. Wherever he went, people gathered around him. He had many friends. Wherever he was involved in activities, he would quickly become the center of attention. To give you an example, years ago after my parents moved to the Orlando area, I was invited to a birthday party for my dad over at the C&L building in downtown Orlando. I thought that it would be a gathering of a few people. Instead, when I got there, it was an enormous room, and the entire company had turned out for my dad's birthday party. The president of C&L got up, put his arm around my dad, and said, "As far as I'm concerned, Dr. Dvores is Mr. C&L." No matter where my dad went, people loved my dad. Now, my mom and dad got married very late in life. My dad was 50 years old when he was married for the first time. My mom was 40. And I think that the old adage is true. Opposites attract when explaining my parents' marriage. Whereas my dad was extremely extroverted, my mom was completely introverted. I think that much of that had to do with her medical problems. Though my dad was the healthiest person I've ever known, my mom was terribly sick her entire life. You don't feel well, you don't really want to be around other people. My mom and dad were opposites in a number of other ways, one of which was their Jewishness. Now that might seem strange because you might think, well, if they're Jewish, why isn't that a similarity? Well, Judaism, or being Jewish, means very different things to different people. My dad was raised in an Orthodox Jewish family that was steeped in Jewish tradition. Theirs was a devout form of Judaism, and my dad adhered to it for his entire life up until the point where he married my mom. My mom, by contrast, was raised in a home that had what we would call a Reformed Jewish character. In other words, whatever they wanted to do, it was a cultural Judaism. They strongly identified themselves as being Jewish without actually following the tenets of the religion at all. All four of my grandparents came over from Eastern Europe in the early 20th century. They settled in New York City and they operated small groceries, and that's how they managed to eke out a living. It was a very, very hard lifestyle. Both my parents were able to move up from that. My mom was an executive secretary. My dad was a doctor. When they got married, they compromised. And instead of being Orthodox or Reformed, they reared me in a conservative home. What that meant is that we kept kosher, we followed many of the traditions, but not as strictly as many of my relatives did. Now, at an early age, I decided that I didn't believe in God. The reason was this. I was at synagogue one day and I was sitting next to an uncle and I asked him a question: why do we do this the way that we do? And his brow furrowed for a moment and he thought, and then he answered, well, we've always done it this way. It's tradition. And that was the day that I really lost any interest in religion and following Jewish traditions, because I viewed them as hollow. In other words, we were doing it just for the sake of we've always done. And if it wasn't real, I wanted no part of it. But my dad and I came to an understanding. As long as I lived under his roof, I would follow his rules. And so I went through 5 years of Hebrew school. I kept kosher the whole time in my parents' home. I followed many of the traditions, but I didn't believe any of them. And when I left, I left all pretense of following Judaism behind. I met my wife at college. Her Jewish upbringing was far less strict than mine had been, but she did believe in God, and so we got married in a very traditional Jewish ceremony at a synagogue, and that was the last time that I really did anything to follow other people's belief systems. Well, 5 years later in Charlottesville, Virginia, my wife and I were born again. It is a miraculous testimony, and I'd love to share it with you, but if I did so now, there wouldn't be any time for the story that I mean to share with you today. So if you're curious and you'd like to hear my personal testimony, you can see it for yourself at www.harrisdvores.com. Well, once I was born again, the most pressing decision was how I was going to share my newfound faith with my parents. You see, to an Orthodox Jew, if a person converts to Christianity, they're considered a traitor to their race. Sometimes the family will actually hold a funeral service and bury them in effigy. Well, to prevent that from happening, I carefully planned how I would break the news to my parents. I was in my 3rd year of law school at UVA when my dad came down for a weekend visit. My mom wasn't also there because she was just too sick right then to travel. So, bracing myself for the worst, I shared with my dad that I now believed that Jesus Christ was our Savior. But instead of the deep disappointment and anger that I had been expecting, my dad said to me, "Son, I've always believed that a man needs 2 things in life, faith and hope. I know that you've never had either of these before. Now I see that you do. So even though you don't believe what I do, I'm happy for you." You could have knocked me over with a feather. I never expected such an understanding response. Well, encouraged by that, I set about proving to my dad that from the Old Testament, he could discern for himself that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. The entire weekend, I witnessed to him from the scriptures in one way or another, convinced that he was this close. And if I could just find the right argument, I could persuade him to become a believer like myself. I had a lot to learn. On the car ride back, my dad said to me, "Son, I sense that you were disappointed that I haven't come over the course of this weekend to believe what you do. But consider it from my perspective for a moment. I have believed what I have my entire life. My father before me believed those same things, and his father before him. In fact, for 2,000 years, every generation of our family until now has believed that Jesus was not the Messiah of the Jews. And now you come along, the youngest of us all, and you say that you alone are right, and I and everyone else in our family history has been wrong. How can you expect me to believe that?" I turned to my dad, and instantly the answer was in my mind. And I said, "Dad, I want to thank you for the incredible way that you've responded to what I've shared with you this weekend. But I'd like to ask you a question. What would have happened if you had had this conversation with your father about Jesus?" My dad laughed. He said, "As soon as I mentioned that name, he would have smacked me across the face, and that would have been the end of the conversation." So I said, "Dad, what if your father tried to have this conversation with his father?" My dad laughed again. He said the same thing, only twice as hard. So I replied, "Don't you see? What we have is not one generation after another affirming that this is the truth. Instead, we have 2,000 years of ignorance. Mine is the first generation that has the freedom to openly examine the question of whether Jesus could be the Messiah of the Jewish people. And I have searched those scriptures, Dad, and I'm telling you today that he is our Messiah. There was nothing my father could say to that. It was a good beginning. Later that year, I finished law school and moved to Orlando. Not long after, my dad retired and my parents moved to Longwood. My dad was 80 at the time, and my mom was very ill, so I felt that time was growing short. Every week, I visited and I talked with them about Jesus. They would listen attentively and ask questions that showed that they were really paying attention to what I was saying. But it never seemed to make any difference what I said. While this was going on, Dad became good friends with his investment advisors, Charles and Francis Schaeff, who were also very strong Christians. They shared the gospel with him many times, but his response would always be at the culmination of what they were saying, "Well, that was interesting. Now let's talk about something else." Years went by. One evening, I had a sudden inspiration. "Dad, suppose I could prove to you that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah so that you had no doubt. And would you put your trust in him if I could do that?" My dad thought about it for a moment, and his answer stunned me. The answer was no. He said, "Son, I'm an old man now. I've lived a wonderful life. I could die tomorrow and be happy. I've believed what I have my whole life long. Why would I change now?" That was the day that I realized that there was nothing that I could say. When I got home, I cried out to God. My parents have heard it all, and they still don't believe. They're going to die soon, and they don't know Jesus. What can I do? It was then that the idea came to me to put everything that I was feeling into a song. The words just poured out of me. The music took a whole lot longer. But finally, it was finished, and I brought a cassette tape over to my parents to listen to. Dad said that he really liked it. Mom couldn't say anything. She was crying too hard. Later that week, I got a call from my dad, and he told me, "Mom has been sitting at the table and listening to your song. She hits the play button, cries her heart out the whole way through, then hits the rewind button and starts it all over again. And she's been doing this for 3 days." Music can touch the soul of a person in a way that words alone cannot. Something had at long last been stirred and broken through a barrier in my mother's heart. But still, they weren't saved. Before I continue with their story, I'd like to play that song for you now.
When I first met you, I thought it'd be so simple. I just tell them who you are and what you've done. But it didn't take too long for me to realize that it's not by words alone that hearts are won. But I can't bear the thought that they would have so high a price to pay. Won't you help them to receive your Son? Even this is not too much for you, Lord. Even this is not beyond my hope. Even though I've done all I can do, Lord, I just give them up to you and then let go. There were times when they would ask me all their questions. There were times when they wouldn't even return my call. But now that they have learned all that they need to, I found that waiting is the hardest time of all. I want so much for them to see that choosing now for eternity. Without your Son, they have no hope at all. Even this is not too much for you, Lord. Even this is not beyond my hope. Even though I've done all I can do, Lord, I just give them up to you and then let go. I know that it's your will that none should perish, and yet our right to choose is still allowed. I'm sure that there must be a way to reach them, but after all this time, I don't know how. You've heard my prayers and you've seen my tears. The hopeful days have stretched into years. Please don't let them die without you now. Even this is not too much for you, Lord. Even this is not beyond my hope. Even though I've done all I can do, Lord, I just give them up to you and then let go. I give them up to you and then let go.
That was an important moment in their journey, but still my parents were not saved. Years went by, and I continued to pray for them daily. I would sing that song to the Lord and told him that no matter how many times my parents said no, I still believed that before the end, he would save them. Finally, the inevitable happened. After a lifetime of wonderful health, my dad was dying. He was scheduled to have an operation that, even if successful, would only prolong his life for a short time. I met with him early in the morning on the day of his surgery. I looked for any possibility, any opening that my dad would want to talk about God. There simply was none. I was with him in his last moment of consciousness. And I knew, as far as any of us can ever know, that if he died, he would be separated from God forever. Well, I went outside into the hallway and I ran into the surgeon. And as we walked down the corridor, we talked about the operation. And I discovered there had been a terrible mistake. The wrong surgery had been scheduled. And so the surgery ended up being scrubbed. I met later that morning with my dad's general practitioner, who told me that I had two options to choose from. My dad had given me his power of attorney, and so he said, Harris, these are your choices. Your dad is unconscious now. He's under the anesthesia. If we were to disconnect the life support, there's a very good possibility he would never wake up and he would just simply die without feeling any pain. Or, if you prefer, we could allow him to continue to exist, because at this point he couldn't breathe on his own anymore. And he said he would probably live for a few more weeks, but he's in terrible pain, and we wouldn't be able to schedule the surgery because I can't find another open slot on the operating room schedule. So he would have to go to a nursing home. The choice is yours. This was the heaviest decision that I've ever had to make. On the one hand, Dad had clearly told me that he did not want to go into a nursing home to die. On the other hand, I knew that if my dad passed away while he was unconscious, where he would end up. How could I make the decision to cut his life short knowing the consequences if I did? I thought about it, I prayed about it, I talked with my mom, and finally I made my decision. I called the doctor and I said, let my dad die. The doctor actually wasn't in, so I said this to his answering machine. Ultimately, what I realized was this was not my decision to make. My dad had entrusted me with his power of attorney. And now that he couldn't choose for himself anymore, I had to choose for him in accordance with his wishes. And as much as I hated the choice he had made, I had to accept that it was his decision. I'd made one other phone call to Charles and Francis and told them, if you ever want to see my dad again, you have to go now because he's dying. I left and went home, and I waited for the call that my dad was dead. As I paced back and forth in my living room, I remember crying out to God and saying, all these years I've trusted you. I never stopped believing that even though it might take a long time, that in the end they would be saved. This is the end, Lord. There is no more. How will I ever sing that song to you again? Shortly after that, the phone rang. But it was not the phone call that I was expecting. Charles and Francis had gotten my message, and they immediately stopped what they were doing and rushed over to the hospital to be with my dad. And apparently they got the message before the doctor did because he was still alive and intubated. They went up to his room and they called out his name, they tapped on his arm, and they revived him and got him to where he was conscious again. And then Francis had a very bold conversation with my father. She said, "Now, Mort, we have had this discussion many, many times through the years. I'm going to ask you one last time. When you die, do you want to go to heaven?" This time my father nodded yes. See, my dad never before said that he believed in heaven, but this time he nodded. And so she said, "You know that prayer that we've talked about so many times, that your son has prayed and that we've prayed, but would you like to pray it too, so that your sins can be forgiven when you stand before God?" He nodded again. She said, "I know you can't talk anymore, so I'm going to take hold of your hand and I'm going to pray for you. And what I want you to do is, if you're praying on the inside, what I'm praying out loud, then I want you to squeeze my hand and let me know that you're praying along with me." And so a few words at a time, she led my father through the sinner's prayer. And then at the end, she said, "I don't want there to be any doubt. If this is what you want for yourself, Mort, then I want you to nod your head twice." And he did. And my dad was saved. When she told me this news, I just lost it. You see, in my mind, when I gave the order to end my dad's life, he was already dead. And now, instead of the call letting me know that it had happened, instead I find out, and not only is he still alive, but he's going to live forever. After I thought he was dead, God saved my dad. The arm of our God is never too short to save. I went back and visited my dad at the hospital for the next couple of days. And then on Sunday, I went to church in the morning. And I got up before the church and I shared the testimony of what God had done. I think perhaps now there might be one or two people watching who were there that day. After the church service was over, I went to the hospital and the nurse said, "I'm so sorry, your father has passed away." And I asked them, "Could you look up the time?" And it was to the moment after I had shared publicly the testimony of what God had done for us in saving my dad. A year later, my mom went out to Thanksgiving dinner with my wife and myself. And afterwards, we went back to her apartment. And my wife started talking with her about God. It was the most anointed I had ever heard her. When we came back to the house, there was a message waiting for us on our answering machine. My mom had made the decision to accept Jesus as her Savior. Not long after, she went to be with him. The surprise ending to this story is that I am giving you this testimony today of my parents' salvation. And I didn't directly lead either of my parents to the Lord. That wasn't the role that God had called me to. My role was to believe God for their salvation. Throughout all the long years of their unbelief, no matter what they said or didn't say, I never stopped trusting that God would save them. And perhaps that is the role that God has for you. To stand in the gap, trusting in God for the salvation of the ones that you love.